There is a quiet assumption buried beneath almost everything we are taught about history. It is so familiar that it rarely feels like an assumption at all. We are told that civilization began when humans learned to plant, to settle, to organize, to invent. That writing marked the start of memory. That law emerged from chaos. That order slowly rose from confusion. But the oldest records do not describe themselves that way. They do not speak of discovery. They do not celebrate beginnings. They do not sound like people standing at the edge of something new. Instead, they speak as if they arrived late. When the first scribes pressed marks into clay, they did not explain how authority came into being. They did not ask where laws originated. They did not pause to justify why time should be measured this way, or why cities should exist at all. They wrote as if these things were already settled, already understood, already waiting. This is easy to miss because modern readers expect origins. We look for first moments. We search for invention stories, for breakthroughs, for the spark that turned wandering groups into civilizations. But the earliest texts do not offer that comfort. They are strangely restrained, almost procedural. They read less like creation stories and more like handover documents. Humanity does not appear in these records as an inventor. It appears as an inheritor. This distinction changes everything, quietly, because inheritance implies something existed before you arrived. It implies responsibility rather than authorship. It implies limits. You can maintain what you inherit. You can repeat it. You can preserve it. But you did not design it, and you may not fully understand it. The earliest civilizations seem to know this. They do not speak with pride about creating order. They speak with caution about maintaining it. Their tone is not triumphant. It is careful. Lists of kings are written like ledgers. Laws are recorded like reminders. Calendars are noted as if deviation would be dangerous. There is no sense of experimentation, no visible learning curve, no period where ideas wobble before stabilizing. Civilization appears already aligned, already measured, already divided into roles and boundaries that feel older than the people obeying them, and the texts never explain why. That silence matters, because when humans invent something, they usually explain it. They argue for it. They defend it. They record failures, revisions, alternatives. But these records do none of that. They assume continuity. They assume memory. They assume that whoever is reading already knows what came before. And that assumption is unsettling, because we no longer do. From the very first lines of recorded history, the world is already structured. Authority exists. Time is regulated. Land is measured. Cities are assigned roles. And none of it is introduced as new. This suggests something deeply uncomfortable. By the time humans learned to write, history had already begun without them. Writing does not mark the birth of civilization. It marks the moment when humans began documenting something they did not originate. At first, this idea feels abstract, even philosophical. But the more closely you sit with it, the heavier it becomes. Because if civilization was already formed when the first records appear, then the beginning we imagine may not be the beginning at all. It may be a continuation, or worse, a resumption. The earliest texts behave like records taken from the middle of a process. They describe who holds authority next, not how authority was created. They track succession, not invention. Kingship is treated as an office, something transferable, something that can be withdrawn and returned. It is never framed as a human achievement, and this framing is consistent. Across tablets, across regions, across generations of scribes, the same restrained language repeats, not because it is poetic, but because it is careful. The writers seem intent on not altering the meaning, as if deviation itself carries risk. That kind of consistency does not come from myth-making. Myths exaggerate, they dramatize, they announce themselves with spectacle. These texts do not. They whisper. They behave like memory under pressure. When you read them closely, you begin to notice what they do not contain. There is no moment of chaos giving way to order, no narrative of humanity learning how to govern itself, no description of trial and error. Civilization does not stumble into existence here. It steps into place, and that suggests that the system was already there, waiting. Once you notice this, it becomes difficult to unsee. The idea of human progress as a slow upward climb begins to feel misaligned with the record. What we call early civilization does not look early at all. It looks mature, confident, stable, too stable. The texts speak of a world where order is assumed to be natural, where permanence feels expected, where systems function smoothly enough that no one feels the need to explain them. This is not how new systems behave. New systems announce themselves. They justify their existence. They reveal their weaknesses. These do not. They speak from inside a structure that is already complete. And completeness is dangerous, because it raises a question that texts never answer directly. If this order was not created by the people writing about it, then who created it? And why were humans left to maintain it? The records do not say. They do not speculate. They do not accuse. They simply continue. That is what makes them unsettling. They do not sound confused by this arrangement. They sound accustomed to it, as if inheritance itself were the starting condition of history. And if that is true, then something essential has already been lost by the time history begins to speak. Writing does not preserve a beginning. It preserves a memory of something already fading. This is where the discomfort truly begins, because it suggests that humanity's first act was not creation, but caretaking, not exploration, but preservation, not invention, but responsibility for a system whose original logic may have already slipped beyond reach. The earliest civilizations may have known this intuitively. Their fear was not failure, it was forgetting. That is why they copied texts they could no longer fully understand, why they rebuilt structures on the same foundations for thousands of years, why deviation felt dangerous. They did not believe the future would save them. They believed only memory could. And yet, memory is fragile. Once you accept that civilization may have been inherited rather than invented, history stops looking like a clean upward line. It begins to resemble a long act of stewardship carried out by people who knew they arrived late and were trying not to lose what little remained. This does not make them primitive. It makes them cautious, and it reframes the entire story that follows. Because if humanity began as an inheritor, then every law, every calendar, every city plan carries the weight of something older behind it. Something that was once complete enough to be taken for granted, something that no longer speaks directly. What remains now is not an answer, but a shift in perspective. The realization that the silence in these texts is not accidental. It is the echo of a missing chapter. And once you hear that echo, history no longer feels finished. It feels interrupted. Once you accept that the earliest records sound less like beginnings and more like handovers, another detail begins to surface quietly beneath the surface. The world they describe is not only inherited, it is already complete. There is no hesitation in the language, no uncertainty, no sense that systems are being tested or refined. From the very first lines, laws exist as if they have always existed. Calendars regulate time with confidence, measurements align, boundaries are enforced, authority is recognized without debate. This is not how human invention usually appears. When people create something new, especially something complex, they leave traces of struggle behind. Rough versions, competing ideas, inconsistencies, corrections. The early stages of any system are messy. They wobble before they stabilize. They reveal their seams. But here, the seams are missing. The earliest civilizations we can observe through writing do not show signs of confusion turning into clarity. They show clarity already in place. The rules do not read like proposals. They read like reminders. The schedules do not feel experimental. They feel enforced. The cities are not described as organic clusters that slowly found order. They appear already planned, already oriented, already positioned within a larger framework. Nothing is introduced as tentative. This completeness is easy to overlook because we are taught to expect it. We imagine that civilization must have reached this state gradually, that the earlier stages simply did not survive. But the texts themselves do not behave as if they are missing something. They do not refer back to lost experiments or earlier failures. They do not explain why these systems work. They assume that they do. That assumption carries weight. It suggests that whoever first used these systems was not discovering them for the first time. They were applying something that had already been tested, already proven reliable enough to be trusted without explanation. Laws are enforced without justification. Calendars are followed without argument. Measurements are standardized without debate. Standardization itself is telling. Agreement on this scale requires time, coordination, and correction. It requires mistakes to be found and eliminated. Yet no record of that process remains. What remains is only the finished form. This creates a quiet contradiction. Civilization is supposed to grow from simplicity to complexity. But here, complexity arrives whole. Writing does not begin with crude marks that slowly gain precision. It begins structured. Grammar is consistent. Symbols are standardized. Numerical systems integrate smoothly into trade, architecture, and timekeeping. There is no visible childhood. The same pattern appears in knowledge. Astronomy does not begin with guesses about the sky. It begins with cycles already mapped. Seasons align with celestial movements that assume decades, sometimes centuries, of careful observation. The texts do not explain how this knowledge was gathered. They simply use it. Medicine behaves the same way. The earliest medical writings do not read like superstition slowly becoming science. They read like manuals. Symptoms are categorized. Treatments are expected to work. Outcomes are implied. There is no record of trial and error, only application. Law follows suit. Legal codes arrive, structured, hierarchical, complete. Rights are defined. Penalties are calibrated. Procedures are fixed. These are not temporary rules meant to evolve quickly. They are frameworks meant to endure. Endurance implies authority already settled. And authority, when it is settled, does not feel the need to explain itself. It only needs to be remembered. This is where the language of the texts becomes revealing. It is dry, administrative, restrained. It sounds like a system speaking to itself, not like a people discovering how to organize their world. Myths do not speak this way. Myths dramatize origins. They celebrate struggle. They elevate heroes and turning points. These records do none of that. They list, they measure, they assign, they proceed. They behave like documentation. The absence of developmental stages is not a gap, it is a feature. It suggests that the people writing these records were not witnessing the formation of their systems. They were maintaining them. Their role was not to innovate, but to preserve alignment. This explains a great deal about early behavior that otherwise seems puzzling. why cities were rebuilt on the same foundations for thousands of years, why measurements were copied exactly even when conditions changed, why texts were preserved word for word, including errors rather than corrected. Deviation felt dangerous because the system was not fully understood. If you inherit something that works, but you do not know why it works, the safest choice is repetition. Preservation becomes virtue, innovation becomes risk. The completeness of early civilization therefore does not point to genius emerging suddenly. It points to responsibility being assumed. The world described in these records feels mature, not because humans rushed upward, but because something older had already stabilized it. This is where the idea of a pre-flood world begins to feel less like metaphor and more like context. Not a mythical paradise, but a condition where systems were stable enough to be taken for granted. A world where calendars did not need constant adjustment, where boundaries held, where authority flowed smoothly without resistance. The texts do not describe this world in detail. They assume it, and assumptions are often more revealing than descriptions. When a system is fragile, people talk about it constantly. When it is stable, they stop mentioning it. The calm confidence of these records suggests that order was once expected to persist, that permanence felt natural, that decay was not anticipated. This makes the later concern with preservation understandable. Once conditions begin to change, once strain appears, attention shifts, measurement tightens, records grow more detailed, rituals become more rigid, precision replaces understanding. But in the earliest layers, there is no sign of this anxiety. The system hums quietly in the background, unnoticed, uncelebrated. That is the mark of something already solved. Unsolved systems do not appear overnight. They require time, oversight, correction, and intelligence sustained across generations. Yet none of that process is visible here. What is visible is only the inheritance of its results. This leads to a subtle but unavoidable realization. The knowledge that defines early civilization does not behave like something being discovered. It behaves like something being preserved. Writing, mathematics, law, astronomy, medicine all arrive balanced, interlocked, confident, and once they arrive, they do not expand, they harden. Generations inherit them, not as questions, but as answers. The role of the human mind shifts quietly from exploration to maintenance. Curiosity gives way to responsibility. Change becomes risk. This is not the story of humanity rising from ignorance. It is the story of humanity stepping into something already complete and slowly losing the freedom to alter it. By the time history learns how to speak, the system it describes has already been in motion long enough to feel timeless. The beginning has already passed. What remains is continuity, and continuity, when it is mistaken for origin, hides loss in plain sight, because a world that arrives complete also arrives fragile, not because it is weak, but because those who inherit it are not its authors. They can preserve form, but they cannot easily restore function once it begins to fade. The texts do not say this out loud. They do not need to. Their calm, administrative tone says it for them. Civilization did not crawl into complexity. It stepped into it. And once you see that, the question shifts again. If the system was already complete, then its authority did not emerge naturally from human struggle. It came from somewhere else. And that authority, whatever its source, did not belong to humanity to begin with. If civilization arrived already complete, then authority within it could not have emerged the way we usually imagine. It could not have been wrestled from chaos or negotiated slowly between rival groups. Authority, like the systems it governed, appears already settled. The earliest texts do not describe rulers discovering how to rule. They do not show kings learning through failure, or power consolidating after struggle. Instead, they treat authority as something that already exists, waiting to be occupied. Kingship is never framed as an invention. It is framed as a position. Again and again, the language is precise, restrained, almost bureaucratic. A ruler does not create authority. He receives it. He holds it. He passes it on. When one reign ends, another begins, not because the system changes, but because the office has been transferred. This is one of the most revealing patterns in the record, and it is easy to overlook because it is so quietly stated. There is no celebration of conquest, no story of legitimacy earned through victory, no moment where humanity claims ownership of power. Authority behaves like a tool that belongs to the system itself, not to the people using it. One phrase appears with unsettling calm. Kingship descended, not rose, not emerged, not was invented. Descended. The word choice matters because it implies movement, not creation, a relocation, not a beginning. Authority comes from somewhere else and arrives intact. The texts do not pause to explain how this is possible. They do not defend the claim. They simply proceed as if this transfer is expected. That expectation is dangerous, because it suggests that by the time writing begins, the origin of authority is no longer the point. What matters is who holds it next. The writers assume familiarity. They assume the reader already understands what kingship is and where it comes from, but we no longer do. When modern historians imagine early rulership, they picture power slowly crystallizing. Strong individuals gaining influence, groups agreeing to hierarchy for survival, authority evolving organically out of social need. These are reasonable assumptions. They fit human experience. The texts do not support them. There is no gradual climb toward rulership here. There is no visible negotiation. Kingship does not appear tentative or experimental. It is treated as a stable institution that can be transferred, withdrawn, and returned. This is not how myths behave. Myths glorify beginnings. They elevate founders. They explain why someone deserves power. These records do none of that. They sound like institutions speaking quietly to themselves, recording continuity rather than origin. What is most unsettling is what the texts do not say. They never describe a moment when humans earned the right to rule. There is no account of training, no transitional phase where authority is learned. Civilization does not appear to grow into governance. Governance arrives whole, and this creates a strange inversion. Humans are not portrayed as masters of the system. They are portrayed as custodians, temporary holders of an office that existed before them and will continue after them. Once you notice this, the tone of the records shifts in your mind. The long lists of kings stop feeling celebratory. They begin to feel administrative. Names and durations are recorded the same way one would track assets or inventory. This ruler held authority for this span. Then the authority moved on. No commentary, no judgment, no explanation. This detachment is important because it suggests that authority was not personal. It was procedural. The king was not the source of power. He was a function within it. That distinction carries profound implications. If authority belongs to the system rather than the ruler, then the system itself must be older and more stable than any individual who occupies it. It must have rules that predate human leadership, and it must be structured enough that new rulers can step into place without altering its operation. This begins to explain why early kings are described less as innovators and more as caretakers. Their role is not to design law, but to enforce it. not to create calendars, but to maintain them, not to define boundaries, but to respect them. They inherit responsibility, not authorship, and responsibility without authorship changes how power feels. It becomes heavier, less flexible, more constrained. You do not alter what you do not understand. You preserve it. This may be why early rulers appear so conservative, so bound to tradition. It is not because they lacked imagination. It is because deviation felt dangerous. The system they governed was not theirs to change. This also explains the strange calm with which extreme claims are recorded. When the texts assign vast spans of time to early rulers, they do so without emphasis. There is no awe, no justification. The numbers are written with the same tone used to count grain or livestock. That calm suggests that authority once operated under different conditions. Conditions where longevity, stability, and continuity were expected rather than exceptional. Kingship did not feel fragile. It felt embedded in the fabric of the world. And worlds like that do not arise spontaneously. Authority that descends rather than emerges implies a source beyond human negotiation, not necessarily divine in the way later religions imagine, but external, prior, already organized. The texts never tell us what that source was. They do not speculate. They do not mythologize it at this stage. They simply record that authority moved from somewhere else into human hands. This restraint is deliberate. It preserves accuracy at the cost of comfort. Because once you accept that authority was given rather than created, the story of civilization shifts again. Humanity's role becomes smaller, more constrained. We are no longer architects at the beginning. We are caretakers arriving midstream, and caretakers inherit rules they did not write. They may not fully understand the logic behind them, but they enforce them anyway, because the cost of failure feels greater than the cost of obedience. This is how systems survive long after their original designers are gone. Authority continues, not because it is reimagined, but because it is repeated. The early texts show us this repetition in its purest form. Authority is transferred calmly, impersonally, endlessly. The system persists. The people change. And this persistence raises another uncomfortable question. If authority could be transferred so cleanly, then it must have been designed to outlast its holders, which means it was never meant to belong to them. Once authority is understood as something inherited rather than created, the numbers appear. They do not arrive dramatically. They are not announced. They are not framed as extraordinary. They are simply written down, line after line, name after name, duration after duration. And that is precisely what makes them disturbing. The earliest king lists assign spans of rule that stretch far beyond what the modern mind is prepared to accept. Tens of thousands of years attributed to individual rulers, not metaphorically, not poetically, matter-of-factly, recorded with the same quiet precision used to count harvests or measure land. There is no pause to explain, no justification, no signal to the reader that something unusual is happening. The scribes do not slow down. They do not defend the figures. They do not mark them as symbolic. They simply continue, as if this scale of time were normal. Myths usually announce themselves. They decorate their exaggerations. They surround them with spectacle, with divine drama, with monsters and miracles. These numbers are not treated that way. They behave like data, and data carries structure. When you look closely, the durations are not random. They follow a pattern. The earliest reigns are the longest. Then they shorten, then shorten again. A gradual compression of time unfolds across the list, steady and deliberate, as if something fundamental were changing in the conditions of the world itself. The texts never say why. They never describe a catastrophe. They never explain a transition. They simply record that it happened. This is important because symbolic numbers do not decay mathematically. Legends do not behave this way. Propaganda does not follow this kind of precision. What we are looking at does not feel like imagination reaching upward. It feels like memory collapsing inward, as if something vast is being preserved imperfectly, compressed into numbers that no longer fit comfortably inside the present. The pattern suggests loss, not exaggeration. A long span of stability narrowing over time until it begins to resemble the world we recognize. This is where the idea of a different condition of reality becomes unavoidable. Not necessarily a different species or a different physics in the modern sense, but a different rhythm of existence. A world where continuity was assumed, where systems endured long enough for lifetimes to feel like units rather than limits. The texts do not marvel at this world. They assume it. Longevity is not presented as miraculous. It is presented as expected. An expectation is revealing. People do not explain what they believe is normal. The gradual shortening of reigns reads like a record of adjustment, not invention, as if the system itself is adapting to a change it cannot fully prevent. Authority remains, but the time it can be held contracts. Stability persists, but its scale diminishes. This is not the language of mythic inflation. It is the language of decline. And decline does not require drama to be real. It often appears quietly, measured carefully by those trying to preserve what remains. The scribes seem aware of this. They record the change without commentary, as if explanation would be unnecessary or impossible. Once you notice this decay, it becomes difficult to dismiss the numbers as pure symbolism. Symbolism is flexible. It bends to narrative needs. These figures do not bend. They follow a logic. They suggest that the earliest world described in these records operated under conditions that no longer exist. Conditions where authority could be held for spans of time that now feel impossible. Conditions where systems were stable enough that continuity was not threatened by individual mortality. The later world, by contrast, feels constrained. Time fragments. Authority turns over more quickly. The rhythm tightens. The texts do not interpret this shift as progress. They do not celebrate it. They do not frame it as improvement. They simply note it. That neutrality is unsettling, because it implies acceptance, as if the writers understood that something had changed but did not believe it could be reversed. They record what remains rather than mourn what was lost. This perspective aligns with everything else the texts imply. Civilization is not moving forward from chaos. It is moving away from something larger, something more stable, something already complete. The numbers function like shadows cast by a missing structure. They hint at scale without revealing form. They suggest a world that once supported a different relationship to time, one that could sustain systems long enough to make human lifespans feel secondary. And yet, by the time these numbers are written down, that world is already gone. What remains is measurement, documentation, preservation. The scribes capture the pattern because they cannot capture the condition that produced it. They record decay without naming its cause. This is why the numbers matter. Not because they demand belief, but because they resist easy dismissal. They sit uncomfortably between myth and memory, behaving too precisely to be pure invention, too alien to fit comfortably within modern assumptions. They force a question the texts never ask directly. What kind of world allows authority to function this way? And what kind of change causes it to compress so steadily, so quietly? The records do not answer. They only continue, and in that continuation, a realization forms slowly. These numbers are not celebrating the past. they are preserving its outline, a trace of something that once made sense but no longer does. Once authority begins to shrink in time, it signals more than biological limitation. It signals the withdrawal of conditions that once supported continuity itself. The system remains, but the world it was designed for is slipping away. This is not collapse, it is contraction. And contraction leaves evidence not in ruins, but in records like these, calm, precise, unemotional. A final attempt to hold on to scale by counting it, even as it recedes beyond reach. By the time the numbers begin to resemble human lifespans, the transformation is complete. Authority still exists. Kings still rule. Laws are still enforced. But the world that once allowed those vast spans of time has quietly closed behind them. And the texts move on, as if nothing more needs to be said. Once the pattern of contraction becomes visible, the mind looks for a way to contain it. It wants the numbers to belong to one place, one culture, one imagination. It wants an explanation that keeps the disturbance local. That is usually where the idea of mythology steps in, offering a familiar exit. But the pattern does not stay contained. It appears again, far from the river valleys where the first tablets were pressed. It surfaces in lands separated by oceans, by languages, by thousands of years of isolation. And each time it arrives wearing different names, different symbols, different gods, yet carrying the same structure beneath them. In Mesopotamia, rulers reign for vast spans before the flood, then time collapses. In Egypt, divine kings rule before human pharaohs, then withdraw. In India, ages unfold in enormous cycles, each marked by a gradual loss of direct authority. In Mesoamerica, teacher figures arrive, establish order, then depart, leaving humanity to maintain what remains. These traditions do not merely share themes, they share sequence. First, an earlier administration governs directly. Then, a transition occurs. Authority withdraws. Humans inherit the structure. Over time, the system hardens, declines, and becomes sacred. This repetition is the fracture point for the safe explanation. Symbolism can exaggerate. Memory can distort. But neither of them synchronize themselves across isolated cultures. Independent myths do not converge this cleanly on the same administrative framework unless they are pointing back towards something experienced, something later cultures struggled to describe with the language available to them. What repeats is not a story, it is a pattern of governance. And governance is not something humans tend to imagine identically by accident. It reflects lived structure. It reflects how authority was organized, how decisions were made, how responsibility flowed. The remarkable thing is that these ancient accounts do not describe gods creating the world. They describe beings running it. They assign cities. They regulate water. They maintain calendars. They oversee boundaries and cycles. These are not the actions of symbolic forces. They are the actions of administrators. When viewed separately, each tradition can be explained away. Cultural metaphor, religious expression, political propaganda. But when the same structure appears everywhere, explanation becomes more difficult. Coincidence begins to feel less like coincidence and more like residue. Residue of an earlier condition of the world. The texts do not describe this condition with clarity because clarity is no longer possible. What they preserve is the outline, the shape of how things once worked, not the details of why. And that outline is remarkably consistent. Rule precedes humanity. Rule withdraws. Humanity continues without guidance. This continuity matters because it reframes the idea of a golden age. It was not an era of moral perfection or divine favor. It was an era of direct oversight, a time when systems were actively managed rather than merely remembered. When that oversight ends, the world does not collapse. It continues, and that continuation is precisely what allows the memory to persist long enough to be copied into myth. Structures remain, procedures remain, rituals remain, but the intelligence behind them fades. The global nature of this pattern suggests that the event marking the transition was not cultural. It was not political. It was environmental, systemic, or structural on a scale that affected the entire world. Whatever caused the withdrawal did not belong to one land. The records never describe it directly. They only mark the before and the after. The calm world of long spans and stable authority, and the later world of shorter reigns, tighter control, increased preservation. This is why floods appear everywhere, even when they are not described as punishments. Not because water is the point, but because floods erase continuity. They redraw boundaries. They end conditions that allowed long-term stability. Whether literal or symbolic, the flood represents interruption. But interruption is not destruction. The system survives the break. Cities are rebuilt. Laws are copied. Calendars resume. Humanity steps into roles that were once supervised. And because the structures still function, the loss of oversight is not immediately recognized as loss. This is the most dangerous kind of transition. One that leaves the machinery intact while removing its guidance. Over generations, memory takes over. What was once operational becomes traditional. What was once flexible becomes fixed. And because the system still produces order, however imperfectly, it is no longer questioned. This is how a world can change completely without ever announcing that it has changed. The repetition of this pattern across civilizations tells us something uncomfortable. Humanity did not invent the idea of inheritance independently again and again. It experienced it, then struggled to explain it. And when explanation fails, repetition takes its place. The same sequence is written into tablets, carved into stone, encoded into stories, passed down as cosmology and myth. Not because people agreed with each other, but because they were all trying to preserve the same fading memory of how the world once worked. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to treat this as coincidence. The structures align too well. The omissions are too similar. The silences fall in the same places. This does not prove a single answer, but it proves that something older than any one civilization is being remembered imperfectly, repeatedly, across the world. And that memory is not of creation. It is of management. Once the global pattern becomes impossible to ignore, the texts begin to allow a name to surface. Not as a revelation, not as an announcement, simply as a label, introduced as if the reader is already expected to understand what it refers to. The name appears without ceremony. The Anunnaki. They are not described the way gods usually are. There is no thunder, no creation of the world, no demand for worship, no dramatic origin story. The texts do not pause to explain who they are or where they came from. They do not introduce them as characters. They reference them as function. This is one of the most revealing details in the entire record. Because when something is truly mythical, it is explained, dramatized, and elevated. When something is administrative, it is assumed. The Anunnaki are treated like an existing department within a larger system. Their presence is inferred through responsibility rather than spectacle. They decide allocations. They oversee measurements. They regulate water. They assign cities. They enforce order. The tone remains unchanged. Calm, procedural, unemotional. This is not how religion usually speaks. It is how institutions speak. The Anunnaki do not perform miracles. They do not rescue humanity. They do not demand devotion. They meet in councils. They settle disputes. They issue decrees. They withdraw. And when they withdraw, the system does not collapse. It continues. This distinction matters deeply, because it suggests that whatever these figures represented, they were not meant to be eternal rulers or objects of faith. They were part of an operational structure, and operational structures are designed to function until they are no longer needed or no longer able to function. The texts never say the Anunnaki were destroyed. They never describe a rebellion. They never record a victory over them. There is no fall. There is only absence. And absence is treated as a fact of life, not as a tragedy, not as a mystery to be solved. This is unsettling because it implies intentional withdrawal rather than defeat. Something stepped back. Something ended its direct involvement. Once the name appears, it no longer stands alone. Similar figures surface elsewhere under different names, carrying the same responsibilities. Egyptian traditions speak of divine rulers who governed before the first pharaoh. Indian texts describe higher authorities guiding earlier ages before receding. Mesoamerican stories recall teacher figures who arrive, establish order, then depart across the sea or into the sky. Different symbols, same roles. These figures are not creators, they are organizers. Their primary concern is not belief, but balance, not worship, but alignment. They do not define meaning, they maintain function. This is why their withdrawal does not trigger chaos immediately. Systems designed to be managed behave differently when management stops. They do not fail at once. They drift, they harden, they lose adaptability. Humans inherit procedures without inheriting understanding. The texts never accuse the Anunnaki of wrongdoing. They do not frame their departure as punishment. There is no moral lesson attached. This is critical because it separates administration from judgment. The end of oversight is not portrayed as a response to human failure. It is portrayed as a transition, and transitions imply timing. If the Anunnaki were never meant to be worshipped, but were later remembered as gods, that shift tells us more about humanity than it does about them. It suggests that once function is lost, meaning rushes in to fill the gap. When systems stop being understood, they become sacred. Authority transforms into divinity. This transformation does not erase structure. It preserves it, but rearranges its interpretation. Domains remain. Hierarchies remain. Jurisdictions remain. What changes is explanation. Administrative roles harden into archetypes. Responsibility becomes identity. A figure who managed water becomes a god of life. One who regulated time becomes a deity of fate. One who enforced boundaries becomes a judge of souls. Myth does not invent these roles, it preserves them, and preservation without understanding is the theme running through everything that follows. Humanity continues to operate the system long after its original managers have gone. Cities remain where they were placed. Canals still open and close on inherited schedules. Calendars still turn, but no one adjusts them anymore. This is the quiet danger of inheritance. The system still works well enough to discourage questioning. Deviations are feared. Innovation feels risky. The safest choice is repetition, and repetition slowly replaces comprehension. Over generations, the administrators fade from memory. Their names become stories. Their functions become symbols. Their absence becomes normalized. The world no longer feels governed. It feels ordered. An order, when detached from understanding, becomes something that must be obeyed rather than examined. This is how governance survives its own disappearance. It migrates from structure into belief. By the time later civilizations remember the Anunnaki, they are no longer managers of systems, they are gods. But this is not because they changed, it is because humanity did. When oversight withdraws and systems endure, meaning takes over. The system no longer needs to function perfectly. It only needs to be honored correctly. And that shift marks the beginning of a very different kind of world. The withdrawal does not announce itself. There is no final decree, no warning carved into stone, no moment where the texts slow down and explain that something fundamental is about to end. One cycle simply concludes, and the next begins without direct oversight. Names stop appearing. Decisions stop arriving from above. Instructions that were once updated quietly fall silent, and yet nothing breaks. Canals still open on schedule. Calendars still turn. Cities continue to function. Laws are enforced. Life goes on. This is what makes the withdrawal so difficult to see. Collapse is loud. It leaves ruins, ash, and memory. Withdrawal leaves continuity. The system keeps moving, and because it keeps moving, the absence of guidance is mistaken for stability. Humanity steps forward into roles it was never meant to fully occupy, repeating procedures it was trained to follow, not to redesign. The texts reflect this shift without ever naming it. Their language remains calm, administrative, restrained. They do not describe panic or confusion. They describe adjustment. Councils replace administrators. Titles replace functions. Ritual replaces decision. And because the system still works, at least for a time, the loss of oversight is not recognized as loss. It is normalized. This is the most dangerous kind of ending, one that does not feel like an ending at all. When authority withdraws without destruction, it leaves behind infrastructure without intelligence. The forms remain, but the reasoning behind them begins to fade. Humans inherit schedules whose original logic is no longer visible. They enforce rules whose purpose is remembered only as tradition. Instructions are copied word for word, even when meaning becomes unclear. Calendars are maintained with reverence, even as seasonal patterns drift. Boundaries are defended, even when their original function no longer aligns with the land. The system begins to operate on momentum rather than guidance. At first, the effects are subtle. A canal floods where it never flooded before. A harvest arrives slightly out of sync. A decree contradicts an older instruction that no one remembers how to reconcile. These are not disasters, they are discrepancies, and discrepancies invite response. The response is never innovation, it is reinforcement. More records are kept, measurements are repeated, rituals are performed with greater precision. When uncertainty grows, memory is tightened rather than questioned. Precision replaces understanding. Control replaces flexibility. The texts never describe this as a crisis. They treat it as maintenance. Adjustments are filed away calmly. The tone remains procedural, as if the writers believe that enough care, enough repetition, enough discipline will eventually restore balance. But something essential has already withdrawn. Systems designed to be managed behave differently when they are only remembered. They continue to function, but they no longer adapt. And when adaptation stops, decline does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as rigidity. The world described in these later records feels heavier. Rules multiply. Boundaries are reaffirmed again and again. Calendars are checked obsessively. The calm remains, but it is now guarded. Authority feels less natural, more enforced. There is no lament in the texts, no warning, no accusation, just an increased attention to structure, to order, to control. This is how stable worlds end. Not with chaos, but with administrators tightening their grip, trying to preserve balance long after the conditions that made balance possible have quietly disappeared. Eventually, the adjustments stop working. Not all at once, not dramatically, but definitively. Seasonal cycles no longer align with inherited calendars. Water arrives too early or too late. Decisions made according to ancient schedules produce unexpected results. The system does exactly what it was designed to do, but the world it was designed for is no longer the same. The texts never frame this as failure. They frame it as reality. The world has changed, and the system has not. And because the system is inherited rather than understood, questioning it feels dangerous. Innovation becomes risk. Preservation becomes virtue. This is where authority begins to feel sacred rather than functional. The rules are no longer evaluated by outcome, but by obedience. A broken boundary is no longer a logistical problem. It is a transgression. A failed harvest is no longer a scheduling error. It is imbalance. The system protects itself by moving beyond verification. You cannot test a ritual. You cannot audit a belief. And belief is far more durable than instruction. The withdrawal of oversight is now complete, even if no one ever names it. Humanity is no longer governed. It is maintaining governance. The distinction is subtle, but it reshapes everything that follows. From this moment on, civilization does not move forward by design. It moves forward by inertia, carrying the weight of an older intelligence that is no longer present, but still quietly dictating how the world is allowed to function. The machinery keeps running, the guidance is gone, and because nothing visibly collapses, the loss goes unrecognized for generations. When oversight disappears and continuity takes its place, something subtle begins to change in how knowledge itself is treated. At first, nothing looks different. The same words are written, the same actions are performed, the same structures stand where they always stood. But beneath that surface, function is slowly giving way to memory. This is the moment where management becomes tradition. People continue to follow instructions, not because they understand their purpose, but because deviation feels dangerous. The system still works well enough to justify obedience. Fields are planted, water flows, cities endure, and as long as order persists, even imperfectly, questioning feels unnecessary. This is how memory begins to replace understanding. Texts are copied with devotion, even when fewer scribes truly grasp what they record. Certain phrases are preserved exactly as they were written centuries earlier, even when their meaning has grown obscure. Instructions are followed without interpretation. Technical terms are repeated without explanation. Writing no longer serves discovery. It serves continuity. Knowledge becomes ceremonial. Texts are treated as objects rather than tools. They are stored, sealed, catalogued, revered. Some are no longer read aloud, only displayed. Others are recopied by hands that know the shapes of the symbols, but not their original logic. This shift does not happen abruptly. It unfolds over generations. Each generation inherits a system that feels ancient, sanctioned, complete. To question it feels disrespectful. To alter it feels risky. Preservation becomes the highest virtue, and in that choice, the future begins to narrow. Architecture reveals this change with striking clarity. Buildings are no longer designed. They are remembered. Measurements are inherited like commandments. Stone is placed not where it works best, but where it was always placed before. Orientation becomes sacred. Proportion becomes law. Even when conditions change, Even when the environment shifts, form remains fixed. To alter it would be to risk breaking something invisible, something no one fully understands anymore. This is how structure becomes doctrine. The same transformation occurs in ritual. Actions that once had practical outcomes are repeated long after their original purpose has faded. Timing is preserved even when results no longer align. Offerings increase when systems fail, not because they work, but because repetition feels safer than adjustment. When something goes wrong, the response is not correction. It is appeasement. More precision, more repetition, more adherence. The system grows heavier, more brittle, less forgiving. Yet nothing in the texts describes this as decline. It is simply recorded as continuation. The world still appears stable from a distance. Cities remain inhabited. Temples remain active. Records are kept with remarkable discipline. But beneath that stability, something essential has inverted. What was once a living system designed to respond has become a structure designed to endure. Humanity is no longer guided by understanding. It is constrained by memory. Over time, this changes how authority is perceived. Rules are no longer evaluated by whether they achieve balance, but by whether they align with tradition. Correctness replaces effectiveness. Compliance replaces insight. Innovation begins to look like disobedience. Those who follow instructions precisely are trusted, even when outcomes worsen. Those who question are seen as dangerous, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten continuity. The system protects itself by discouraging thought. This is how stagnation becomes self-reinforcing, not because the world stops changing, but because civilization chooses predictability over adaptation. Decline spreads thinly across generations until no one remembers a time when things worked differently. And because the system still functions, however imperfectly, the loss of understanding is not experienced as loss. It feels normal. This normalization is the most powerful stage of inheritance. When limitation is accepted as safety, it no longer needs to be enforced from above. People carry it within themselves. The system no longer presses down externally. It lives quietly in habits, expectations, and fears passed from one generation to the next. At this point, governance has fully migrated from structure into belief. Meaning replaces mechanism. Explanation replaces testing. Obedience replaces choice. The original administrators are no longer remembered as managers. They are remembered as origins. Their procedures dissolve into narrative. Their absence becomes intentional rather than procedural. What was once oversight is now destiny, and destiny is difficult to question. This is the stage where myth completes its work, not by erasing the system, but by sealing it. The inherited order is no longer evaluated for effectiveness. It is defended as sacred. Boundaries become moral truths. Cycles become divine law. The system does not need to work perfectly anymore. It only needs to be honored correctly. This is how memory becomes myth. And myth, once established, does not invite revision. It demands devotion. The world continues under this arrangement for a long time. Long enough that the difference between function and meaning fades from awareness. Long enough that the inherited structure feels natural, inevitable, unquestionable. But beneath that certainty lies a quiet cost. Humanity has not lost its tools. It has lost permission. Permission to question. Permission to fail. Permission to imagine something beyond what was handed down. And that loss, unlike collapsed cities or broken machines, leaves no ruins behind. It leaves only silence where curiosity once lived. By the time inheritance has fully hardened into belief, the cost is no longer visible as loss. It feels like order. It feels like safety. It feels like the way the world is supposed to be, and that is what makes it so difficult to recognize. What disappears first is not technology, it is confidence. When a system is inherited rather than understood, people slowly stop trusting their own judgment. Decisions feel heavier, responsibility feels riskier. Every action is measured against precedent rather than possibility. The safest choice becomes repetition, not because repetition is correct, but because it is familiar. Familiarity replaces truth. Over generations, initiative fades quietly. Not because people become incapable, but because the cost of being wrong feels greater than the cost of remaining stagnant. When rules are treated as sacred, error is no longer instructional. It becomes moral. Failure is not a lesson, it is a transgression. This reshapes behavior in subtle ways. Communities begin to organize themselves around preservation rather than improvement. Status is granted not to those who solve problems, but to those who protect tradition most faithfully. Authority flows upward to those who remember best, not those who understand most deeply. Knowledge becomes vertical, passed downward, never outward. Curiosity survives, but it narrows. Craft remains, but experimentation declines. Skills are refined, but only within boundaries already approved. Anything beyond those boundaries feels unnecessary, even dangerous. This is how a civilization can appear advanced while quietly losing its ability to adapt. From a distance, progress seems to continue. Buildings rise, tools remain effective. Techniques are preserved with impressive precision, but when examined closely, something is missing. Methods are repeated exactly as they were taught, even when conditions change. Repairs follow original designs, even when flaws are obvious. Knowledge is no longer tested against reality. It is tested against tradition, and tradition is far more durable than accuracy. As this mindset spreads, intelligence is redirected away from creation and toward interpretation. Minds that could have explored new possibilities instead focus on memorizing old ones. Mastery becomes imitation perfected rather than understanding expanded. The system has answers, but only to questions it already knows. When unfamiliar challenges arise, whether environmental, social, or internal, the inherited knowledge offers no guidance. It was designed to be applied, not extended. And so adaptation slows, then stops. This is not ignorance, it is limitation. A ceiling forms above human potential, so subtle that most never realize it exists until they reach it and find no way beyond. The past becomes complete. The future becomes smaller. Psychologically, this creates a peculiar condition. People feel necessary but not empowered, responsible but not creative, safe but constrained. They live inside a story already written, tasked with maintaining it, but never altering its direction. Responsibility remains, authorship disappears. Over time, this breeds a quiet dissonance. The system promises meaning, yet offers no room for contribution. Discomfort is explained away as destiny. Frustration is reframed as duty. The burden of order is accepted without question. This is the deepest cost of inheritance. Not the loss of knowledge, but the loss of permission. Permission to question why something is done. Permission to imagine alternatives. Permission to fail without sacrilege. And because this loss spreads gradually, no single generation chooses it. Each group makes the safest decision available. Each chooses preservation over risk, and safety compounds into stagnation. By the time the consequences are visible, they feel normal. Limits feel protective. Boundaries feel necessary. The absence of choice feels like order. the system no longer needs enforcement. It lives inside expectation. People carry it within themselves, policing their own thoughts before action is even considered. Change feels reckless. Doubt feels irresponsible. This is how governance achieves its most stable form, not through control from above, but through acceptance from within. And once a system reaches this state, collapse is no longer required to end growth. Civilization can continue indefinitely, outwardly intact, inwardly narrowed. The future becomes a careful repetition of the past. What remains is a world defined not by what it can become, but by what it must preserve. And preservation, when extended to long, becomes a kind of silence. A silence where questions no longer form, where imagination no longer reaches outward, where history continues, but only along paths already traced. This is the inheritance humanity carries, not as burden alone, but as habit. A weight so familiar it is rarely felt, until something shifts. At some point, long after inheritance has become habit, a different kind of silence begins to appear. Not the silence of forgetting, and not the silence of obedience, but a quieter space where the inherited story no longer answers every question. It does not arrive as rebellion. There are no shattered monuments, no declarations that the old order was wrong. The shift begins as fatigue. The system still functions, but it requires more effort than it once did. Rituals multiply, rules thicken, explanations feel heavier than outcomes, and slowly, almost reluctantly, someone notices that maintaining the inherited order now costs more than understanding it ever did. The realization is small, almost gentle. What if preservation and truth are not the same thing? What if the system we protected so carefully was never meant to be permanent? What if it was designed to hold the world steady for a time, not to define it forever? This question does not accuse the past. It reframes it. It suggests that inheritance was once necessary, even wise. That obedience preserved stability when direct oversight ended. But it also suggests that preservation, when extended indefinitely, becomes delay. Tradition becomes inertia. Meaning becomes substitute for function. The most unsettling part is that no rule ever forbade this question. It was postponed by comfort. As long as the system worked well enough, asking deeper questions felt unnecessary, even irresponsible. Why disturb what still holds? Why risk imbalance for curiosity? And so the question waited, quietly, patiently, across generations. But postponement carries its own cost. The longer a system goes unquestioned, the heavier it becomes. What once could have been adjusted gently now feels tied to identity itself. To question, it feels like erasing meaning rather than refining structure. This is why the moment of questioning rarely looks dramatic. It looks like a soft adjustment, a ritual shortened, a rule interpreted differently. A decision made with reference to outcome rather than precedent. Nothing breaks. The world does not collapse. It exhales. Authority no longer comes from age alone, but from relevance. Memory regains its proper place, not as command, but as reference. The inherited system does not vanish. It is contextualized, honored without being obeyed blindly. And with that shift, responsibility returns to human hands, not certainty, not permission, responsibility. This is not liberation through destruction. It is maturation through choice, the willingness to act without a script, to fail without sacrilege, to adapt without betrayal. What follows is not a clean ending. History rarely offers those. It offers openings. If civilization was inherited, then it was never meant to be the final form of human order. It was a bridge, a a structure built to carry the world through a transition, and bridges are not destinations, they are crossings. The question left behind is not whether the past was wrong, but whether we are still meant to live inside it, whether preservation has quietly replaced participation, whether the silence we inherited is meant to be kept or finally broken. And as this story fades, there is no answer waiting, only a space, a pause, a gentle reminder that the most powerful systems are not the ones that rule openly, but the ones we stop questioning. Rest here for a moment. Let the weight lift slightly. The past will still be there when you return, but the future, quietly, is no longer written.